I guess you could call it bittersweet, that out of one of the darkest tragedies of my life, there was hope that was birthed. And I knew that I'm not going to waste his death, right? I'm going to make sure that I honor him by the way I live the rest of my life. And now I know that there's something greater than me who's going to help me do it. And I think that that's the good that comes out of a weird and crazy and dark story where God really he got my attention in probably the only way that he ever could have.
Welcome to T is for Trauma. I'm your host, David O'Connor. My guest today is Maurice F Martin, who is a musician, an author, and a podcaster. During the interview, Maurice talks about the self-destructive path he was on, from dealing with severe anxiety and depression, which progressed to the point of always needing to be in an altered state, to then losing two brothers in a short period of time, leading Maurice to the lowest point in his life. But there was a moment of divine intervention that would kickstart Maurice's healing journey, and he now works as an addiction counselor and life coach. This is a wonderful conversation, and I really appreciate how Maurice opened up and shared so candidly the journey his life has been so far. And now, without further ado, here is my conversation with Maurice F. Martin. Maurice, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks so much. I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah. I like to start every episode off with gratitude. And in today's case, you are an individual who is incredibly talented across a number of different fields. You are an author, you are a musician, you are a podcaster. And my gratitude is for all of the ways that you are acting in service of others. So I wanted to say thank you for that.
Thank you so much for those kind words. I think the hardest thing in life I'm finding is learning to take the gratitude when someone gives it. So I'm just going to say thank you.
I wanted to start all the way back in 2016 on your wedding night. And can you describe what that night was like for you?
Absolutely. Most people think of, those milestone moments as the most beautiful moments in your life. And unfortunately, when I think back to my wedding night, I think that I would almost call it a rock bottom moment for me, not because of who I married, not because of who was there on my wedding day, but because of what was really exposed in my life. Just a couple months before that, one of my brothers had died, and that was the second brother in 2 years, as you know. And I remember walking outside and looking around and thinking to myself, the world is a much scarier place than I remember it being. And I don't know if I have what it takes to be the husband that I need to be, the human that I want to be. I don't know if my life is really going to count the way that I want it to if something doesn't change. Doesn't mean I was a terrible person, but I felt lost. And so that moment was certainly a turning point in my life.
Was this before the wedding had happened or after the ceremony?
Afterwards. This was the actual wedding evening, right? And so my wife had asked me if I could run to the store to go grab something, and I walked outside of the hotel, and that was me looking around outside of the hotel going, wow, what is this life thing, and how am I going to survive it, and how am I going to make sure that I become the husband that she needs, and just, it was the overwhelm after the wedding, honestly.
And how did that evening play out for you? What was the end result?
By the time I'm going to say this on a podcast. By the time I got back to the room, my wife was asleep. So there was no, wedding night fireworks that they talk about. There was just some wedding night tears for me. I remember getting back to the room, and I looked and she was actually laying on the bed asleep. And I sat down and just kind of looked at her and thought, I'm such a lucky man. I hope that I can do what it takes to make her happy, and that I can also find happiness in myself. I remember that feeling very well.
I know you had mentioned your brother passing, and in talking to you before this episode, I know there were a number of factors that had led to that panic attack coming on. Could you talk a little bit about what those factors were that led up to kind of everything coming crashing down at once?
Absolutely. One of the things about my life, I have done a lot of things and truly accomplished a lot in my life. But one thing that I've realized is that I had a lot of empty accomplishments. Um, Performing in front of thousands of people, performing with Grammy winners and Emmy winners, and doing all kinds of things that were great for my resume and great for my storyline, but didn't really fill up my soul. And by the time I got to 2016, I just felt like my life was reeling. In so many ways, I'd left a job that I had loved. My band had broken up. I had we had had some car issues, and it was just one thing after another. And there was one day I was literally driving to work. I'd gotten up in the morning. I smoked some marijuana because, quite frankly, I could not handle going to work sober anymore. And I was driving down the road and I started screaming at God. If God even was real, if God could really hear me, if there was something greater than me, you need to hear me now because I'm over this. And so that was really one of the catalyst moments, and that was about a month and a half before my wedding night, 2 months before my wedding night, um, that I sat in that moment and thought, I don't know where my life is going, but it can't continue to go like this. And it was just a few weeks after that that my brother died. And so now think about how I was already in a spiritual conundrum of, God, what is this life? And then suddenly my brother had no life. And I thought,
Wow.
now I really have to figure it out.
And that was also the second brother who had passed
Mm,
in quite a short period of time, right?
yeah, it is. It is. My other brother had actually died of a drug overdose the year before. And I didn't know the other brother quite as well as the second brother who passed. And so, each one had its own type of trauma and its own type of grief, as you can imagine. When my first brother passed away, actually, the day of his wedding, one of my best friends, excuse me, the day of his funeral, one of my best friends from high school, he literally died on the day of his funeral. And so I was sitting bedside with one of my best friends in the world as he was taking his last breaths. We got in a car. We drove to the funeral so we could bury my first brother. And so there was already, a deep place that I went into at that point, and it only got darker by the time I got to 2016.
Wow. That's a lot of grief for somebody to deal with in such a short space of time.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing is, the question is always, did I really grieve, right? And so,
Yeah.
as a counselor and a life coach, one thing that I've learned is that oftentimes people go through dark situations, but they don't really grieve. So, sure, I cried some tears at the beginning, but I kind of got tough for everybody else, and I made sure I was strong when anybody needed to have a conversation. Later on, I would learn that it's really the breaking down and the tears that is the true strength. And I didn't always have those moments. I kind of drank those moments away at the beginning, honestly.
I know you had said that you did not have much of a relationship with that brother, the first brother who had passed.
hmm
Was his death accidental, or was addiction something that he had struggled with at that
Yeah,
time?
addiction was something he had struggled with. And the sad thing is, it's a lot of the stories that you hear. He was really starting to get focused and trying to turn his life around, and he was feeling like he was getting a second chance at life. And so I had a pretty deep conversation with him a couple weeks before he passed, and he was optimistic and hopeful. And those are the moments when you really learn how fleeting life is, right? That things can shift at the drop of a dime, and that's how it was for him. Addiction. I'm actually an addiction counselor now, and so I literally work with people these days who are fighting for their life. They're trying to find hope and then trying to maintain that hope, and that's not an easy thing to do.
I wanted to switch gears for a minute
hmm
and go back to childhood because
Sure.
I know there is something of a trend of addiction in your story.
Mm.
Where did you grow up?
So I grew up in Conneaut, Ohio. I grew up in a house with my mom, my stepdad, and my younger brother. And we had what I would have thought of as a great, beautiful, all American life. In a lot of ways, right? A nice home, parents who worked. I know a lot of friends didn't grow up with a mom and a dad in the house, so I was blessed in that way. Um, but within the life, you also experience sometimes traumatic situations, and sometimes they're not purposeful. In other words, one thing that I've learned about my own journey and my own story is that trauma does not always come because people were intentionally trying to traumatize you. Sometimes it's
Right.
people trying to help you, people trying to push you, people trying to mold you in a positive way. But life can still be life and you can still be triggered and affected. And I would say that I was one of those people who just unfortunately some of the things that I experienced and I saw didn't always shape me in the greatest of ways.
What forms did that take for you in terms of the things that you experienced at a young age?
I mean, one of the biggest things, domestic violence. Seeing it within the house and hearing it within the house, verbal and physical abuse that took place within the house. Some of those things were commonplace in certain periods of my life, for sure. And I almost think that the things that I heard were maybe even harder than the things that I watched. All I mean by that, I think the first time I actually saw domestic violence and saw my mother hit, I was probably 5 or 6 years old, very very
Mm.
young. But later on, when some of the words became toxic that I heard as a kid, what I could never do and what I would never be and what I would ruin and what I would destroy. Some of those words that I heard, that were abuse, quite honestly, started to echo in the corridors of my mind. Right? You start to replay
Yeah.
those words so much that they become your own words. You hear your voice attached to them eventually, and so that probably has been the greatest thing that I've had to heal from my childhood.
Did you also experience physical abuse?
Some, yeah, absolutely. I don't think that I looked at it as physical abuse when I was a kid, right? I don't know that my parents would have looked at it that way either. And so, what is the fine line between abuse and discipline? It's a fine one.
Yeah.
And so, what I would say was, I can certainly pinpoint a few moments when the line was crossed and it went past just discipline for discipline's sake. But there were also some moments where it was probably just something that was maybe needed in their eyes for structure. I try to be careful whenever I describe someone else's actions and their reasons for it, right? Because at the end of the day, I have my perception and everybody else has theirs. And so what I can say is certainly the line was crossed. Certainly there are moments where I'm sure my parents wish they could take back. And there are moments that left scars and left wounds, whether intentional or not.
Yeah, we're roughly about the same age, and I
Mm,
think this is definitely something that is tricky or challenging
mm,
or very complicated for our generation. I think
absolutely.
the generation that raised us had a much different view on physical discipline,
Hmm.
and it can be difficult for sure to unpack that sometimes in retrospect in terms of what was appropriate and what was inappropriate, especially by today's lens.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially by today's lens, right? The way that my wife and I parent is so different than how we were parented. And it's not just because of all the things our parents did wrong. We just literally live in a new culture with a new perspective. And so I try to always look back at the past with a level of grace. I know that for you, that's one of your big words, right? I always
Right.
look back at the past, with a level of grace that, um, whether you had good intentions, bad intentions, whether you crossed the line or not, whether it came from you being unhealthy in a moment or it was came out of love, you get grace for all of it, right? Because you can't undo any of it. You can't change it. We can't rewrite history. And so, what I don't want to do is to vilify anyone, while at the same time, it's important that I tell the truth of what happened in my life so that I can heal from it.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. What are some of the ways that the abuse that you suffered during your childhood and teenage years affected your life? What were some of the ways that it showed up for you?
Mm. Showed up in heavy anxiety and depression. Depression is something that I would say came and went throughout my teenage years and hit me extra hard by the time I got to my 20s. It started off as just feeling sad, feeling out of place, feeling like nothing that I did was good enough. And then at some point, it really fostered itself as rejection. I began to think that, well, you know what? My my biological dad didn't want me when I was a baby. I feel unwanted inside of my home and unloved in some ways, and those feelings mounted and they built. The first time that I went to a doctor to see is he does he need medication for his depression? I was still a teenager, right? And I didn't need anything. I didn't need to take any pills, but the doctor said you have to watch yourself. And by the time I got to about 19 years old and in college, that's when I started therapy. And to be honest, I remember my first therapy appointment, the first official one. And I sat in a room and I used very different language than I use today. That's important for the listeners to know. I remember saying, my parents loved me. They were hard on me because they saw my potential. But for some reason, I feel down and I feel anxious and I feel overwhelmed and I feel like I'll never be good enough. And I remember her looking at me and she was holding a clipboard and she put it down on the side. She said, Maurice, can I ask you a question? And I said, yes. And she said, I have heard everything that you've said. And I said it was the first appointment. It might have been the second or third by then. She said, I've heard everything you've described about your childhood and your life. She said, I've never heard you use the word abuse or trauma. She said, but clearly you're a person who has experienced some real abuse that has shaken you to your core. When will you accept that that's the truth? And I remember sitting back and going, no, I must not have explained things well. I
Right.
must not have expressed myself the right way. I gave her the wrong impression. And she said, no, this anxiety that you're describing, these panic attacks that you're having, this dark feeling that you're getting overwhelmed by, this is the effects of trauma. This is the effects of abuse. And you're going to have to face it if you're going to get any better. That was 19 years old. And I don't think I really faced it for over a decade after that. But that was the first time I really came face to face with what I was dealing with.
I know that was quite a number of years ago. Were those words in your vocabulary at the time?
No, they really weren't. I think that when I thought of whatever abuse was, which I really didn't know, I thought of, the kid locked in the basement in the dog cage. You know what I mean? Like, I thought of the
Yeah.
extreme story that you saw on the news, right? Um, I never thought that it was what I had experienced. I thought that was just love. And that's been one of the hardest things I think for me to learn and unlearn and relearn in my life is, well, what is love then? If some of those moments, if there was a line crossed, well, how does a person show love, and how does a person create discipline, and how do people create
Right.
healthy boundaries? Right, that I've had to revisit all those things.
Right, because when it's not modeled for you, what do you look for as good examples of that?
That's it. That's it.
I also wanted to ask a pretty similar question to the last one, but
Mhm.
you had mentioned having depression and anxiety in your teenage years. Again, was that something that you were consciously aware of, or was that something that someone had to tell you that you were experiencing? Because in my case, I realized as an adult that through my teenage years and during college that I had really suffered with depression and anxiety, but I had not been aware of that at the time. I thought
Mm.
just, I didn't want, I was more of a homebody, or I didn't like going out as much. But when I look at it now through this more informed lens, I realized that I really did have very acute periods of anxiety and depression.
That's such a good question. For me, I would say that by the time I was about 17, I knew something was wrong. I didn't share it with many people, but I remember the conversation with my mother crying in a room saying, listen, um, I'm sad, I'm depressed, I'm crying myself to sleep a lot of nights. I'm waking up and my thoughts are racing and I can't calm them down and I can't slow down and I don't know what's wrong. I'm riddled with fear. I'm overwhelmed. And I remember just kind of going off to my mom about all these things. When I look back, I'll be honest with you, I think that there were moments of anxiety and even moments of depression when I was a young boy, that I would never have identified that way. I, when I think about it now, what I realize is that I learned very well how to laugh my way through pain. Okay. So I learned how to
Right.
use my wit and my charm and kind of stir myself out of a dark headspace. And so sometimes when I got uncomfortable, when I got nervous, when I got overwhelmed, I was able to charm my way out of a situation to get away from it and then decompress. I didn't know at the time, oh, that's anxiety. I didn't know at the time,
Right.
oh, this heaviness that you feel is you depressing. You're depressed. But by the time I was a teenager, I knew. I mean, I was sitting in rooms sometimes all alone with a weight that was on me that I didn't hear the other kids describing, with heaviness of feelings that nobody else was talking about. And I really didn't have words for it until I was probably in my late 20s, even. I don't think that I knew how to describe accurately the heaviness, the anxiousness, the weight of it all. I feel like I've always been someone who carried the weight of the world on his shoulders and wanted, hey, as soon as I get successful, I'll help all the people around me and I'll love on everybody. And I was always the person that, kids would call in high school and, hey, I'm going through some stuff. I've heard you're good at this. Can you talk to me and help me? I think I was a
Mm.
counselor long before I became a counselor and a life coach long before I was a life coach, but I didn't understand that I was also somewhat empathetic, right? That I was taking on other people's emotions as well. And I certainly didn't know at that young age how to separate your heaviness from my heaviness and the heaviness around me from the heaviness within me. And those are all things that I learned later.
And then also finding therapy at what I would say is a relatively young age.
Mhm.
What were the circumstances that led you to going to a therapist?
I was angry. I remember in college, I really didn't drink much during my freshman year. And, everybody was having parties and going out and things. And one night, I started drinking with a couple of my buddies in the dorms. It was illegal to drink in your dorms, but I was doing it. And I remember that once I got drunk, the anger that came out of me was something I hadn't seen before. And and then I actually had another incident after that, and somebody sat me down and they said, hey, you were kind of scary yesterday. Whatever that was that came out of you is probably something that's been in you for a while and you need help. I wish that I could say that I got all the tools that I needed at that point in therapy. The truth is, I went to therapy for a few months that semester. It helped me a bit, but I really needed more therapy. I needed to keep going. And I didn't go back to therapy again probably for another 4 years, 4 or 5 years. And even then, it was for a short period and then a long delay. And so I think that's one of my greatest regrets that I didn't stick with therapy and really let it take me through the growth. And so that's why I think that I had that moment in 2016. By then I was 32 years old. So, that's a much older version of me who was having to deal with that same problem and those same issues.
I'm curious. Do you think you would have been ready to work through that stuff if you had stuck with therapy at that age?
No. I think that's
Yeah.
why I ran, right? I think that
Yeah.
I'm human like everybody in that there's always the voice on the inside that says woulda and coulda and shoulda and maybe if you would have and what would have happened if, right? But the truth is, I don't think that I was really ready to look honestly at some of the situations that really did have a huge effect on me. As a 38-year-old husband with two children, I see life, I see parenting, I see life, love, and the pursuit of happiness very differently than I did as a 19-year-old kid trying to find his way in the world, right? And so I think that sometimes that's important that for the listeners to hear is that we have to understand that our capacity and our capability of learning, growing, and healing changes over time. And so what I was capable of at 19 is very different than what I'm capable of now at 38.
When that friend made that observation to you about being angry or like seeing a different side of you, had that come as a surprise to you? Was that something that you were aware of, that all of this anger was inside of you at that time?
Yeah, no, I knew. I knew. Um, I know now that anger is a secondary emotion, and I knew that I was sad and that I was extra sad and that I was lonely and I was extra lonely and I was lost and I felt extra lost. And I knew that I was also very good at suppressing those things. By the time I was 19, I knew myself well enough to know you do a really good job of hiding how you feel. I was the king of, hey, Maurice, how are you? Oh, man, you know I'm always amazing. How are you? And what I actually did was took all of the attention off of me and put it to you and made you sincerely answer the question. And I just dodged the truth altogether. Um, so when somebody said you need help, I thought, yep, yep. I didn't think it was going to come out this way. I didn't think it was going to turn into anger, but I'm not shocked because I know something's wrong in there.
I wanted to jump again to staying on the theme of anger and the story that you had shared with me about your anger with God and being in the car
Mm-hmm.
on that fateful day. Can you share that story with
Mm-hmm.
the listeners, please?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Here's what I remember about that morning. It wasn't that it was different than a lot of other mornings. It was that I was more honest. For several months by that point, I woke up in the day and I thought, what am I doing with my life? Where is it going? What am I going to accomplish? I don't have music anymore. I feel like I don't know who I am anymore. I don't see any money in the bank. And I just felt like there was nothing in my life from the inside that was making me feel happy or whole or with it. And I remember when I got in the car, there was a part of me, I didn't know that I wanted to make it to work. And that's the honest truth. I don't know if I just want to drive until I run out of gas and just nobody finds me. I don't know if I want to take this car and drive it off something and just be done with this journey. But I was in a headspace when I was sick and tired of being sick and tired, and I was sick of feeling hopeless. And so when I started to yell at God that day, it wasn't all clean language. There was profanity and there was screaming and there was everything. And what changed my life was that was the first time I ever heard the voice of God. Um,
Mhm.
the actual first thing that happened was I had a vision. At that point, I would have considered myself a Christian who believed that God existed and who wanted to go to heaven if he died. But I wasn't in anybody's church. I wasn't praying, with any sort of regularity, but I thought God was real. Okay. That's about as far as it went. Um, and when I saw the vision, I saw myself standing on a stage preaching the gospel, and there was people as far as the eye could see. And I
Mhm.
remember that all of a sudden I came back into the car and I started hearing his voice speak. And the first thing he said was, you don't understand how precious and valuable life is. You were put on this earth to change more lives than you understand, but you will not be able to do that if you won't heal. And I was in that moment, I realized that God was real. And in that moment, I realized that I was going to be accountable to change something, that I was who I thought I was. I'm not the only person. There's people who are listening to this podcast right now, and they know they have a purpose. There's people who know that there's something they were born to do. They don't quite know what it is, but they know that they were meant to do something. They were meant to change lives. They were meant to make a difference. In that moment, it was like my higher power confirmed for me that I was who I thought I was, but that all the other stuff that had shrouded it, all of the darkness, all of the anger, all of the frustration was going to ultimately keep me from that purpose. Will you heal? Will you get better? And in that moment it started the wheels spinning in a whole different way in my mind, and um ultimately that really catapulted me to all the changes that I needed in my life.
Right. There was a double side to that sword, though, right? Because
There
there
sure
was
was.
also a darker message.
Yes, there was. Um, so this is where my story gets a little weird, and some people may say, "Oh, you sound too spooky and weird," and that's okay. Um, what I heard was someone in your life is about to be taken, and I need you to pay attention. I need you to grow from this, and I need you to learn from this. And if you could imagine me going from the awe of going, "Wow, God is real," and I hear Him, I hear His voice clear as day, to, oh my God, why and who, and is there another way I can learn these lessons? And so when I say that my brother died shortly after that, um, it was prophecy fulfilled. I was the first
Wow.
person who wasn't on the scene to find out. The police, the authorities did not go out and tell my mother, and so I had to drive to her home. I was the one who told her that her son was gone. I held her while she cried. I told all of the family members. I spoke at the funeral. I helped make arrangements, but I was strangely prepared for that moment. And so it was kind of, I guess you could call it bittersweet, that out of one of the darkest tragedies of my life, there was hope that was birthed. And I knew that I'm not going to waste his death, right? I'm going to make sure that I honor him by the way I live the rest of my life. And now I know that there's something greater than me who's going to help me do it. And I think that that's the good that comes out of a weird and crazy and dark story where God really he got my attention in probably the only way that he ever could have.
If you can talk about it, what were the circumstances behind your second brother passing?
Sure. He actually drowned. And so part of the interesting part of that story is I told you that I was drinking and using drugs in that period of life, just marijuana, but um, I was in a place for sure. My brother was very different than me. That night, he was with some friends and they were all drinking. He wasn't. He was sober and he was on, like a small canoe boat in somebody's backyard. They had a little body of water and the story is that they were kind of had it doing some horseplay on the boat, and the boat flipped over, and he actually couldn't drown. His friends tried to save him, and he was wrestling and fighting too much, and they couldn't save him, and he actually drowned in someone's backyard. And
Wow.
so it was obviously a tragedy for my family and I. He was 25 years old, and there's not a day that goes by that I don't think of him. But at the same time, it's also through his death that my life has changed in so many ways. I guess you can kind of see the pattern, right? That everything that happened in that part of my life gave my life a different type of meaning and gave me a new desire to grow.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really tragic.
Hmm.
I did want to talk about, you had mentioned using alcohol and marijuana to zone out or disconnect from what you were feeling at the
Hmm.
time. Was there a time in your life where that kind of really took hold or really started to escalate?
Yeah, I think that when it really started was a few years before that. I was working at a job, and the job gave me an opportunity to start working on the road. And during those few months, a lot of the people who I was around were heavy drinkers. And before I knew it, I was in the category of heavy drinkers. For a couple years after that, and about that time, I want to say I was about 27 or so, um, I was able to still drink in a way that was manageable. Okay. So it was only on the weekends. It was only during times when it wasn't going to affect me. I was really, if it was a party, great, but otherwise I'm going to stay managed. By the time 2015, 2016 came, that was a different story. Now I was going to work high. I was smoking sometimes on my lunch breaks. There was a couple times during that period of time. I hate admitting this, but it's the truth. I remember more than once a 15-minute break at work where work was so stressful that I went to Circle K that was right by where I worked, and I grabbed, a tall can of malt liquor and I drank it as fast as I can and went back to work. I mean, it was to the point then where I certainly wasn't healthy. I certainly wasn't in a good place. I never had the moment that many of my clients that I work with now have. I never had the DUI. I never had the intervention, other than I guess the godly intervention. I never had many of those consequences. But the truth is, I knew that I could not continue this type of behavior and maintain the respect for myself, let alone my new wife and all these other things that I wanted in my life. And so something had to change.
You said that you did not have necessarily a rock bottom moment. Was there an inflection point that started your healing journey?
That's a good question. I think that that's why I always point to the wedding night, because I think that was the start of the healing journey. One thing that I can say about my wedding day was that we were surrounded by love. There were so many people who were just happy for us. And I remember feeling like there's got to be a way that I can love me as much as they do. There's got to be a way that I can be as proud of myself as they are. And I was back in therapy by that point again. And I remember talking to my therapist after that, and I said, for whatever reason, something in me is telling me I can have what I want. I don't know how hard it's going to be, but I feel like I can be proud of me, that I can learn how to love me for real. And I feel like that night was the turning point, because there had to be a way that I could see what they saw. If I could now see how scary the world was, if I could now see that God was real, if I could now see that life could shift in a moment in tragedy, then certainly my life could shift in a whole bunch of intentional moments when I focused. So I think that's why I always look back to that night. Yeah.
And what forms did your healing take? Like, what were some of the things that really worked for you as you healed?
So many things. First of all, I'm a musician, and so music is really at the core of what I call my life recovery. I don't really say I'm in like the traditional recovery, but my life recovery. What the listeners can't hear, I have inner ear monitors in right now. They're helping me to hear this interview. I have music playing in my ears, so you just can't hear it. And so what I started doing, I started listening to soaking music and turning to prayer as I listened. And I started journaling, and then the journaling turned into playing music and writing music for therapeutic reasons, not just writing for performance. Um, I think that there's that reading books. I really turned to scripture and also to other books that just really helped me to see life with a new perspective, to see life and look for meaning in a different way. And so I think those were the main things, the ability to learn how to pray and meditate, the ability to sit in a moment and get used to the silence. And then also just learning how to express my feelings, which probably is honestly the hardest thing for me. That's probably the thing people would think is easiest. I'm a motivational speaker, I'm a counselor, I'm a lyricist, but finding the courage and the words to express my feelings has always been the hardest thing, because I could say one thing while I felt another. And so being
Right.
transparent and honest and being authentic is really the hardest part of the journey for me. And I think that those are the ways that I really learned how to do it, seeing myself and then expressing myself with what I saw.
Yeah, it's such an interesting thing that it, it seems to be a lot easier to find grace and compassion for others than it is to find it for ourselves.
So much easier. I
And
think that
it seems
that
like the journey would also be a lot easier if we could just find what we have for others.
Yes, and I think that that is one of the greatest lessons that I learned, honestly, is that one of the things that I learned as a counselor, I'm a group counselor, and so I end up sitting in a room, and there will be anywhere from 5 to 25 people in a room with me. One of the things I say a lot nowadays in my life is God has a way of putting you in front of you. And all I mean by that is there's somebody with a similar story. There's somebody with a similar demeanor. There's somebody with who is battling through what you're battling through in that moment. And a lot of times, because you have compassion for them, or because you believe in them, or you have faith in them, you learn how to have it for yourself if you allow yourself to be introspective, if you allow yourself to be self-aware. And so to me, presence is the most important thing, is that now I've learned how to live life with presence, so that when I look around, I go, whoa, the love for myself is sitting there in the chair. I can love you, and you're helping me learn how to love me. So we're helping each other in this moment. And I learned so much from other people, just like hopefully people learn from me.
I love that. That's very similar to something that we end up talking a lot about on this show, which is the compounding power of healing. And
Mm,
even when we ourselves are not fully healed, whatever that term can mean for people,
right.
w- even when we have done some of the work and we can find that compassion and that grace for others in their moment of suffering, that allows them to advance their healing journey. And
Mhm.
then that has this network effect outwards of influencing the people that they are then in contact with in a positive way. And it ends up being this radiating outwards of healing and positivity that I think is really beautiful.
Yes, that's so well said. And I think too, the key to that compound healing is the word healing, right? It's that if I realize that I'm still healing and it's a work in progress, it opens me up to the possibilities of that taking place, that compound healing. If I say, well, I've put the stamp on it and that chapter's done and I never have to heal from that thing again, I'll always look to help another person and miss the blessing coming back to me. And so if I realize, nope, healing is an ongoing journey. Uh 20-year-old Maurice had to heal differently than 40-year-old Maurice will have to. And so I'm
Right.
a constant work in progress, and so are you. And so now we can continue to help each other heal. I think that's the beauty in it, that healing.
In terms of your work with addiction counseling, what got you into that work and how long have you been doing that for?
I started in, I want to say 2017, and a lot of it was, I would just say, my pursuit of purpose. I realized that I wanted to make a difference. I wanted to help people, and I was open to figuring out how to do it. And I had a moment where actually a friend of mine offered me an opportunity to teach music at the facility he was working at. And he said, I'm working with teenagers, but come and teach music and help them out. It's their at-risk youth, and I worked with the kids. And afterwards, the director of the program walked up to me and he said, "I think you would make a great addiction counselor." And I was like, "Addiction counselor?" And he said, "Yeah, I just watched you work with these kids." And he said, "If you have half the heart for people that you just showed for music and these children, then you're going to help change some lives." And I took that as a divine moment. That was, just a year basically after the moment in my car and God saying, something's going to change. And so I took a chance. I started my first addiction job. I didn't know how long I'd be there. I didn't know if I would want to stay in that career field. And I found that I came alive doing it. I sat in rooms with people, and my life felt like it had more meaning. All of a sudden, my trauma and my tragedy and my pain and the fact that I was starting to grow through it was giving other people hope. And it kind of propelled my recovery too, right? Because I had to stay ahead of the people sitting in front of me. I had to make sure that I was continuing to do what I needed to do to be focused and to be happy. And not fake happiness, but I mean to find contentment in life. And
Right.
so I have found that being in the addiction world it's life giving for me. I would go to the place that I work at for free if I had to, right? It's that kind of a love and a passion for what I do. And I can't say that for a lot of other jobs I've worked, but it makes me come alive to see a person with hope in their eyes who looked hopeless the moment that I met them.
It's amazing.
Hmm.
If somebody did want to start exploring working with addiction counseling, what do you think are some of the things that they should know before entering the field?
Good question. The first thing you have to know is that it's hard. I don't know what people think of as addiction. I really don't. And so all that I can say is that whatever I thought it was, it's not. I've worked in a facility where it was the people who were sleeping under the bridge who are now in the facility. I've experienced that with clients, but I've also had professional actors and professional athletes sitting in front of me. I've seen doctors and lawyers and mailmen and photographers and podcasters and every other job you can think of, pastors and preachers and school teachers, right? And so what I've learned is that it's hard because people are broken in ways that you'd never know they're broken. And what's even worse is when you see a person start to change and then they come back to the facility and it didn't work. The change didn't settle in. The things that they wanted didn't stay the way that mine did. And it breaks your heart. And so the biggest thing that I can say is that you have to know it's hard and you have to take care of yourself. That you do not want to be the counselor or the therapist who is not practicing self-care but is preaching self-care to everybody else, because in the
Right.
end you end up burned out. Even though you're happy that you were there, it doesn't work. So I think that the greatest counselors I've been around, the greatest therapists, they realize that it's hard. They know that addiction is not easy to deal with, and they know that they have to be healthy in order to speak and preach health.
Do you think is there a specific factor or circumstance that differentiates people who their sobriety sticks versus people who they have these lapses and
That's
you see them over and over again?
that's such a good question. I can't pinpoint one single thing. We've seen studies that say that spirituality can be a great spark to recovery, and that people see leaps and bounds of growth in a much faster period of time. But the reality is, I've seen all of it at this point, right? So I've seen the
Yeah.
person who seemed unfocused in the rooms, seemed like they didn't really want to get better, and they've walked out and they've never relapsed. I've seen people who seemed like they were on fire for recovery and they were having these growth points and growth moments in every area of their life, and they walked out and relapsed within a week. I feel like I've seen it all. And so I think that the greatest thing is, a person has to decide that they want to get better, because recovery is not for the faint of heart. You have to know that you're going to have to engage your heart and not just your mind. We see a lot of people who walk into the doors and they think, if you teach me the one, two, threes of recovery, I'll be okay. Well, the truth is that when that depression creeps in, when the self doubt rises up, when the anger comes, those things are not just affecting your mind, they're affecting your heart too. And if you're not going to engage all of those same things in your recovery, you're going to be in a losing fight.
Yeah, I think you see that a lot as well in therapy. People
Hmm.
think they're going to think their way out of their problems,
Hmm.
and it's always a losing battle
Of
because these
course.
are not problems of logic. These are emotional problems or problems of the heart, and
Hmm.
trying to do it without incorporating that side of things, you're almost always going to fail, I think.
Yeah, well, your problems have layers. And I think that people need to understand, if I'm looking at the field of my life and I see a huge tree sitting in the field and it's ugly and it's everything I don't want, and it represents the worst parts of me. I need to know that just because I start hacking at parts of this tree, there's also some very deeply embedded roots that I have to know are there too. um, it's when you're walking down the hallway and someone says something to you that sets you off. It's the car that cuts you off on the road, and suddenly you go from 0 to 10. Well, why did you go from 0 to 10? Because there's deeply ingrained things that just got triggered. And sometimes it's me from when I was 16 that got angry. It's the me from when I was 5 who feels like somebody's screwing me over. And so it's learning that pain and wounds can be deeply set from long ago, and what we can be experiencing today is simply a pain point. If you want to get better, you're going to have to not only look at what you feel today, but how often have you felt that way over the years? And when did you start feeling that way? And how do we think we can grow through that so that that feeling can eventually stop being so overwhelming? And every pain has a journey. Every teardrop has a journey, right? That has triggered its starting point. And I think that's what we need to know, and what we need to show people as therapists and counselors and coaches, is that that pain has come from somewhere, and you will need to go somewhere in order to help heal it.
On the topic of deep wounds and early wounds, I know you had mentioned having a lot of anger and witnessing some very traumatic things at a very young age and experiencing some very traumatic things. I'm curious, is your stepfather still alive?
He is. Yeah, he is still alive. We really don't have a relationship at this point. And I've realized that that's probably for the best right now. One
Yeah.
thing I know you and I talked about yesterday when we had our conversation was that sometimes when it comes to forgiveness, um, you're going to have to forgive and yet find closure sometimes on your own. That sometimes when you approach a person, they're not always going to react the way you think they should or wish they would when you look forward to finding closure or to be able to close a chapter of your life. And so that's one of those situations for me where I've really had to turn inwardly and turn upward to find the closure that I need in that situation. Because I don't think that I'll ever get it in a one-on-one interaction, unfortunately for me.
Yeah. And what were some of the ways that you did try to find closure with him?
Mm. Well, right around the time of my wedding, I actually, did the whole writing a letter, a long drawn out letter that never got responded to, and then I invited him to my wedding, and he came. Um, wasn't the kindest when he was there, but was there. And some of the things that he said to me on my wedding day was kind of the last straw for me, and I realized that if I'm going to heal, I can't have excuses, right? So I can't say, well, I can't heal because look what he said, right? That's not going to work. So what I had to do was be accountable for myself. I've reached out, I've let my feelings be known, I've expressed myself in the healthiest way possible. I've prayed for you whether you know it or not. And now what I need to do is heal my wounds. If you choose to reach out to me, beautiful. But if not, I've just learned that I have to cherish what I have in front of me and not get lost in what's not there in front of me now. Hmm.
And it also sounds like having healthy boundaries was also part of that healing
Absolutely.
journey.
Absolutely. That's
Yeah.
one of the things that we teach, right? That at the end of the day, love has boundaries. Respect has boundaries, right? All of the things that we really pursue in a healthy life, it all has boundaries and limitations. And so I've had to learn that if I'm going to see myself in a new way, it starts in the mirror. It doesn't start with a person and their title or who they've been in my life, but it starts in the mirror with me learning to respect myself and love myself and value myself despite it all. And then that makes forgiveness a lot easier. I forgive you for whatever you've done. It may not mean that the boundaries I have now will have me up close and personal with you, but it doesn't mean that I'm allowing hate to stay in my heart because that would be blocking me today and I can't afford that.
Yeah, that's something that I found very revelatory
Mhm.
when I heard it. I heard
Mhm.
somebody say one time that boundaries are for your benefit, not for their benefit,
Yes, they are. Yes, they
even
are.
though it often seems like the other way around.
Yeah, because if I hold someone too close who's going to scar me and give me deeper wounds, well, I pulled you in. And so one of the things that I say to people, um let's say I'm working with a client and they walk into a room and they say, Maurice, how do I fix my marriage? Or Maurice, how do I fix this broken relationship with mom? I give the same answer almost every time. I look at them and say, you ready? And they say yes, and I say, fix you. what,
Mhm.
what do you mean? I want to fix. Well, the healthier you become, the more effective you'll get at communicating, the healthier you'll get in terms of valuing yourself and valuing the bonds and relationships you have in front of you. The healthier that you become, the more that you'll understand what boundaries do and don't need to be. And so I think that the key is that I have to be able to clean out whatever is blocking my perception so that I can see more clearly. So when I heal, when I have, healthy therapy sessions and healthy journaling sessions and I'm becoming more mindful, I begin to see life with a clearer lens. Now I can communicate what I see. Now I can protect myself effectively. Now I can convey love and joy and peace in a more harmonic and harmonious way. And I think that's the key. It's that clarity that comes from working on you first, then reaching out. And that's effectively what I've done in some of my difficult relationships and in difficult seasons. And I continue to, because again, right, healing, it's an ongoing journey.
Yeah. In terms of your work as an author,
Mhm.
you have two books. The first is Save the Day, and then the second is My Butt is Too Big.
Your butt is too big. That one will be coming out
You're,
hopefully in January. Yeah.
okay, and that's BUT.
Yes, BUT.
So, have you finished writing that one?
Actually, I'm kind of putting the finishing touches on it now. I've actually written 3 versions of that book so far, and I needed to actually do a little bit more healing work before I was ready to finish it. I was
Yeah.
looking at my outline and what I had already written, and I thought, I need to say something different at the end of this book. And so that's really where I'm at right now, is literally finalizing the end of it, and then I'm going to be doing a workbook with it. But the concept is simple. It's that people often say, well, I'd be getting healthy, but well, I'd be working through things, but right. And to me, that's very similar to everything I see, even when I pick up scripture. That what I often see is people saying, well, I mean, God, I would go there, but I don't speak very well. I mean, well, I would do what you say, but I'm too young for that. And so we always tend to have these reasons and excuses as to why we don't do what we say we want. I believe that that is tied directly to what you have been through in your life that has gone unprocessed. So it's that guilt, it's the shame, it's the grief, it's the pain that is unresolved that now stands like a giant in front of you and makes you feel like what you want is impossible. And so the more you heal, the more you can say, okay, well, this is going to be hard, but I can do it. This is going to be scary, but I can make it through this. I'm worth it. And I think that it's when your belief gets bigger than your butt and your health gets bigger than your butt that you're able to do everything you desire.
And then with Save the Day, what is the message of that book?
Uh, no one is coming to save you. Save yourself. Uh, uh, I love comic books, and I love the thought that you could put up the bat symbol, and that Batman would come flying in to rescue you. But the truth is that Batman is a jacked up individual too, and he's got problems. And so, if you really if you really want to heal, if you really want the life that you want, the person who's going to help you do that is staring you in the mirror, and I really believe that. And it's not even just self help, right? I mean that it's accountability. It's saying I want this, so now I have to do something about it. I say that I want to get healthy. Okay, will you go to a therapy session? Will you open up that journal and write? Will you say the difficult thing so you get what you want? And what I've learned is that many people actually run from everything that life is calling them to walk towards. They run from everything that God calls them to walk towards. And so the key is stand and take one courageous step at a time in the direction of the life you say you want.
Awesome. That's really great. The last thing that I wanted to ask about was your podcast.
hmm
Can you tell people a little bit about that and kind of what the message is and the topics that you cover during your podcast?
Sure, absolutely. Um, so the story behind my podcast is one of my buddies and I. He's a good friend, and we have had all of these. I guess I'll call them heartfelt conversations. Sometimes not even so nice with each other. You have to change your life and figure out what you want. Um, and so um, one day we were sitting down and we thought, what if we started to turn on a microphone and have these heart to hearts with the world listening? And that's really where it started. And so, um, if you go to my website, that's probably the easiest way that you can find it. But you just go to mauricefmartin.com. Um, the one thing that I want to say is that our podcast it's spiritual based, it's faith based, but it's also real life. It is one of those things where you're going to hear people who are going through real struggles and real pain and talking about it in a mic. And I really believe that you'll hear what Christianity really sounds like and a real walk really sounds like, that it's not all rainbows and butterflies and sunshine, but it's people persevering through complications.
And
It
that's
is
called the Grace Factor podcast?
Grace Factor I didn't realize I didn't say it. Grace Factor podcast. Just type in Grace Factor on Google. You can go basically any platform that has podcasts, and you'll find it there. And then there's also it's called BU Entertainment. If you look up the podcast there, you'll be able to find it there also.
Okay. And you guys are between seasons currently, right?
Yeah, so we just actually had a conversation last week, and we are starting to try to figure out what the format's going to be for season 2. We were just talking about trying to bring in a few guests for this season. The interesting thing about our podcast, grace factor, what does that mean? It basically means you're going to have an imperfect walk, and you're going to have to need the grace of God. During our first season, my co-host, his daughter got gravely ill. He got sick, and sometimes I had some serious issues happen in my family, and so you hear kind of that journey. So season 2, we actually have to recap because we've had some more trauma and some more drama happen since season 1, and then we're also going to be bringing in some guests to talk to as well.
And when can people expect season 2 to start being released?
Good question. I hope in November. We were just talking about hopefully going back in November to record. So I would say November, December, you should start seeing new episodes pop up. But we've got 10 or 11 now. So if you haven't listened to one yet, you'll certainly have a chance to catch up first before we start that next season.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll link all of the things that you mentioned in the show notes for this episode.
Perfect.
Before we wrap up here today, is there anything else you wanted to promote or direct people towards?
I'd love for everybody to visit my YouTube channel. Just look up Maurice F Martin on YouTube. That's where most of my fresh content, other than the podcast, of course, is posted. A lot of inspiration. And then I told you that one of the things that I do is listen to therapeutic music. And so I write it now. So on that channel, you hear not only me speaking and motivating and praying for you, but also just therapeutic music that you can sleep to or walk to or pray to or whatever it might be. So just look for Maurice F Martin on YouTube, subscribe there. And then if you are interested in, me as a coach or anything else, any of my services, feel free to go to mauricefmartin.com, and people can read more of my bio. They have the ability to reach out if they need a speaker, coach, anything else.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll definitely tag all of that stuff when I'm releasing the episode.
Much appreciated.
Well, Maurice, this has been a really amazing conversation. I really appreciate the candor and the vulnerability and the honesty that you shared with us today. And I think this is going to be appreciated by a lot of people. So I wanted to say thank you for that.
Well, thank you so much for what you do. I mean, you are opening up conversations and pushing the conversations in ways that is truly going to make a difference, not only for yourself, for all of the people who are on the show as guests, but also for the audience. And so I hope that it continues to grow for you, and that you change a lot of lives through your podcast.
In a similar vein as you said when we started this conversation, it is also difficult for me to receive praise and appreciation. So I will also just close with a heartfelt thank you for that.
Absolutely.
Good talking to you, Maurice. Thank you.
Great talking to you too.